Abby was intrigued with her father's sudden late-night trip to the shed. She wanted to know why he went out to his shed so late and, as any curious 12-year-old would, decided to confront her dad about it. But he prevented her from getting close to the shed, and she started to suspect he was trying to hide something from her. Knowing she had to find out what it was, Abby decided to take matters into her own hands. But what she discovered was something she would later regret. What was her father's secret? She wanted to uncover the truth. Abby's father had made it clear she wasn't allowed to go inside the shed, which was weird as she could always walk in freely whenever she needed something like a shovel or a rake. Abby's father had made it clear she wasn't allowed to go inside the shed, which was weird as she could always walk in freely whenever she needed something like a shovel or a rake. When her father wasn't home, she decided it was time to go inside the shed. Her heart pounded as she got closer with the key in hand. With trembling hands, she placed the key inside the lock and turned, just as her father pulled up on the driveway. Abby froze. Should she go inside anyway? There was no going back now, so she pushed the door open. There in the middle was something she didn't immediately recognize, but when she did, all she could do was scream and cry. But what was her father doing in the shed? Why was it a secret? And what will Abby find? Abby lived with her parents, Florence and Connor, in a normal house. She had normal neighbors and went to a normal school with normal students. But what she was about to discover about her father was far from normal. It was abnormal, to say the least. One night, as Abby watched TV in the living room, she heard the back door closing shut with a bang. She didn't think much of it at first, as her father went out to get more wood for the fire every now and then, but when no one returned, she got curious. She slowly got out of her seat and listened to the silence in her house. Her mother was having dinner at a friend's house, so Abby knew she was home alone with her father. But now it seemed he was gone too. This was very strange, as Abby knew she wasn't allowed to be home by herself. She was only 12. She walked into the kitchen while calling her father's cell phone. She heard a buzz coming out of his jacket and realized he couldn't be far, as he wasn't wearing anything other than jeans and a t-shirt. Then she heard a noise coming from the backyard. What was going on here? Her heart began to race as she approached the back door. What if her father wasn't there? What if there was an intruder, and he was trying to fight him off? But she was quickly assured that her father was, in fact, still home. He was just busy in the shed. Abby sighed a sigh of relief. But her relief was short-lived, as her father had never before worked in the shed at these hours. She wondered what he was doing in there, and quickly put on a pair of slippers. She stepped out in the yard and let the back door fall shut behind her. Her father must have heard the door closing as he suddenly appeared. "My darling, hi," he said as he walked toward Abby. "What are you doing here out in the cold? Let's get you inside, shall we?" Do you want a hot cocoa? But Abby wasn't stupid. She knew her father wanted to diverge her interest in the shed, but she was a sucker for a good cup of hot cocoa, so Abby followed her father inside. He made her the best hot cocoa she had in a while, and they drank it together at the dining table. "What were you doing in the shed, Dad?" she eventually asked him. Her father nervously shifted in his seat and eventually told her he was just organizing it. He probably thought that would be a boring enough reason so she wouldn't be interested anymore, but what he didn't know was that she had gone inside the shed just a week ago, and it looked squeaky clean and well organized, so his explanation only raised more questions. Why would he lie to her? A short while later, Abby's mother returned home, and her parents put her to bed together. Abby didn't say a word about the shed, as she didn't want to start a fight between her parents, but it stayed on her mind all night. She could see a bit of the shed from her room, so she walked to the window to look. She looked at her alarm clock first and saw it was past midnight. She didn't expect the light to be on, but she wanted to check anyway. And to her surprise, the light was on. Abby could even see movement from inside the shed. Her father had clearly returned to the shed as her mother slept. Abby's curiosity was piqued by this. Not only was her father lying to her, but to her mother as well. She sneaked out of her room and to her parents' room to see if her mother was indeed still there, and she was. Abby then slowly sneaked down the stairs and through the back door. This time she had learned from her mistake and didn't let the door fall shut. She gently closed it behind her, so it made close to no sound at all. She paused for a second to really make sure her father hadn't heard her, and then proceeded toward the shed. She heard the sound of her father being busy halfway across the yard, so he wasn't being exactly secretive about being in there. But when she arrived at the shed, she noticed he had hung trash bags in front of the windows. She could only see shadows, and there was no way she would be able to peek inside because of this. She listened silently to hopefully hear what her father was doing. She might be able to make something out of the noise. But it was all very chaotic, and he wasn't using any tools. It actually sounded like he was talking to someone, but Abby heard no response. Could he be on the phone? Abby couldn't hear what he was saying, only muffled sounds and sometimes laughter. Whatever he was doing, he seemed to be enjoying it, so why would he be so secretive about it to his wife and daughter? Abby was about to knock on the door and confront her father when he suddenly stopped talking, and another sound echoed through the walls. The second sound was far from positive. It actually made chills run down Abby's spine. After hearing the sound, she didn't want to stay near the shed any longer, so she ran back inside, not thinking about closing the door slowly. The door slammed shut behind her as she ran up the stairs and jumped into bed. Abby held her breath as she listened to the sound of her father exiting the shed and slowly coming inside. She could hear the creaking sound of each step he took on the stairs, and as he got closer, her heart raced faster. Soon after, he stood in her room, in silence. Abby lay as still as she could, closed her eyes, and pretended to be asleep. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek as he peeked over the side of her face to see if she were actually asleep. Then he slowly backed away and went into his own room for the night. The following morning there was tension between Abby and her father. It was obvious to her, but her mother had no clue. Why would she? She had been asleep during the night, and only Abby knew what she had heard coming out of the shed. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about that horrible sound. As soon as she arrived home from school, she decided to finally go inside the shed. Her father wasn't home yet, so it was the perfect time. Her mother was busy in the kitchen cooking dinner and wouldn't think twice about Abby playing in the garden. So she went to the backyard and played a bit as a decoy. When Abby figured her mother wasn't listening anymore, she stopped playing and slowly walked over to the shed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she brought her hand to the handle and pushed it down. Only the door didn't budge. It was locked. But Abby wasn't about to give up. She knew the garden tools were in the shed, so she went inside the house and asked her mother if she could use the little shuffle they had to pretend play in the garden as a gardener. Her mother saw nothing wrong with that and said she could take it out of the shed. When Abby told her the shed was locked, she was clearly surprised. Her mother walked over to the shed and tried it herself, seemingly confused that it didn't open. "Damn it, Connor," she muttered as she walked back inside and frantically searched in the key tray. Abby waited patiently, but her father could be home any minute. Finally, her mother found the key and gave it to Abby. Abby quickly took the key from her mother and ran to the shed. She felt she had to hurry up, as she didn't want to be near the shed when her father came home. She placed the key inside the lock and turned, just as she heard her father pull up on the driveway. Abby froze. Should she go inside anyway, or should she run back inside and hope her mother wouldn't say a thing? She knew her mother couldn't keep a secret, and definitely not if she didn't even know it was a secret. So she decided to go inside anyway. There she could hide from her father and just hope for the best. She slowly opened the door to make no sound. Her father was now getting out of his car and walking to the front door. Only a small fence was in between them, so the slightest creaking sound could be heard. She paused for a second and listened to her father opening the front door. Then she quickly went inside. The shed was dark, but Abby was too afraid to put on a light. Her father would definitely notice it from inside the house. She tried walking around with her hands in front of her, but she kept bumping into stuff. Then she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her foot, and she screamed. She knew her parents must have heard her, so she quickly rushed out of the shed just as her parents came running into the garden. "Abby? What's going on? What were you doing in there?" her father frantically asked her as he rushed over to the shed's door and quickly shut it. Abby cried in pain as she grabbed her foot. There was a bit of blood, and Abby's mother immediately brought her back inside. There she inspected the wound and found a tiny nail. Abby must have stepped into it, as she wasn't wearing any shoes. "Connor, weren't you cleaning up the shed?" her mother snapped at her father. Abby's father was as white as a ghost. I thought I had put everything away." "I'm so sorry, Abby. But what were you doing in there? Did you see anything? Or hit anything?" her father stammered. Abby shook her head. "I was just playing," she said. She didn't want her father to get suspicious. After that night, her father kept the key to the shed on him at all times. Her mother hadn't noticed it, because her father had hung another key with the same keychain in its place as a distraction. But Abby watched her father's every move. There had to be a reason why he was acting so strange about the shed. She knew she had to hurry even more now. as her father could move his secret project to a different location. She was sure he felt guilty for Abby stepping on a nail in his workplace, so there was a good chance he would move places within the next few days. Abby knew her father would drink a few beers every Friday, and whenever he did that, he would always fall into a very deep sleep, sometimes even in front of the TV. So when Friday came, she was ready. She pretended to sleep until her clock said 12, and silently headed to her parents' room. She slowly opened the door and walked over to her father's side of the bed. But to her surprise, she only saw her mother sleeping. This probably meant her father was asleep in front of the TV, so she silently walked downstairs. The TV was still on, which was a good thing because Abby stepped on a very loud floorboard. The creaking sound of the floorboard was very loud, and Abby's heart was pounding in her chest. She closed her eyes and expected her father to turn around and see her, but he made a loud snoring sound instead. Abby sighed in relief as she realized her father had fallen asleep in his chair. She slowly walked over to the chair and listened to her father's snoring. She crouched down behind his chair, just in case he would wake up. The key was half hanging out of his pocket and dangled from the key ring. Abby stretched her arm straight in front of her, but could only reach the key with her fingertips. Suddenly the key started slipping and dropped to the floor. Abby quickly pulled her arm back and held her breath. Her father woke up because of this, but was so sleepy that he walked straight by her on his way up the stairs. As soon as she heard the door of her parents' bedroom close, Abby snatched the key from the ground and ran outside. She was halfway to the shed when she stopped in her tracks. She had stepped into something before, and she didn't want to step into something again, so she quickly turned around and grabbed her slippers. When she arrived at the shed, she slowly placed the key inside the lock and turned. The door was old and made of thick wood, so Abby knew he was going to creak if she were to open it slowly. Because of that, she figured it wouldn't make much noise if she were to open it fast. And she was right. She swung the door open and quickly stepped inside. She had no phone or flashlight on her, so she had to find the light switch. The shed was dark and cold, and Abby waited a few minutes so her eyes would adjust to the darkness. She saw all sorts of scary shapes inside the shed, and suddenly she really wanted to leave. Abby felt her heart pounding in her chest, and she had trouble breathing silently. Everywhere she looked, she saw something that scared her. She desperately felt around the door in search of a light switch, but it wasn't there. She felt a little to the side but quickly pulled her hand back when she felt something sticky. Moments later, something crawled over her hand, and Abby could only just hold back her scream. She had touched a spider web, and the spider had gotten onto her hand. Abby swung her hand from side to side until the little creature flew off. Out of frustration, Abby started to cry. She wanted to get out of there. As much as she wanted to know what her father was hiding in this shed, this was just too much for her. She was still a little girl, after all, and it had already taken a lot of courage for her to even come here. Normally she would pull the blankets over her head when she saw even the slightest shadow in her room. She sat on the floor and cried for a while, too afraid to get up and find her way out of the shed in the dark, but also afraid of going on and discovering her father's secret. Finally, when her eyes started prickling from all the tears, she sat up straight, dried her eyes, and took a deep breath. Abby realized nothing was going to happen if she didn't do it herself. She had to push through the fear and find that damn light switch. She slowly got up and felt around her. She found a broom and used that to guide her through the darkness. Carefully she felt the walls until finally she found the switch. She flicked the switch, and a single light bulb in the middle of the shed jumped on. Abby had to shield her eyes from the light as she was so adjusted to the darkness, but within a minute or so, she could look around her. In this light, the shed wasn't so scary anymore, but she had to hurry up. Phew. They are still asleep. She slowly opened the door to check if her parents' light was still off, and it was, she thought. She silently closed the door again and turned around. The shed was cluttered with all sorts of objects and garden tools, but she quickly spotted something that looked out of the ordinary. There was something at the back of the shed with a white sheet over it. Abby couldn't make out what it was by the shape, but it looked terrifying. The sheet that covered the object was stained red, and it almost looked like blood. Abby's heart started racing again, and she felt short of breath. Abby slowly reached her hands toward the sheet and grabbed it tightly. She didn't dare to grab it on the stained parts, so she made sure to only touch the white parts of the sheet. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, ready to pull off the sheet. But something stopped her. "No, I'm so close. I'm not giving you P. A sudden thought shot through Abby's mind, but she quickly pushed it away, she thought. She started counting down from 10, but when she reached number 4, she suddenly heard someone calling her name. Abby, it was her dad. Abby quickly let go of the sheet and hid behind the lawnmower. She heard her father getting closer and closer to the shed and listened as he slowly opened the door. Abby, he asked again, "Are you in here?" But Abby stayed quiet. She had no idea what her father would do if he found her here, next to his secret project. "She's not here," Abby's father suddenly yelled. "She's not. Where could she be?" Abby's mother yelled back from inside the house. That's when Abby realized they were both looking for her, and judging by the sound of her mother's frantic voice, they were very worried. She decided to wait it out and quickly go to her room when they weren't watching. But first she had to wait until her father was further away from the shed. The door was slightly open, so she could see her father just standing there, unsure of what to do. Then he ran inside when Abby's mother called him. Abby quickly got up and wanted to walk away, but caught a glimpse of the white sheet in the corner of her eye. No, she was so close. Was she really going to let this perfect opportunity go and go back to square one, she thought. She quickly turned around but bumped against a bucket as she turned. The bucket fell to the ground with a loud bang. "Abby," her father yelled again as he made his way to the shed. Abby quickly ran to the object and grabbed the sheet. "Abby," her father yelled, now standing at the door opening of the shed. "Abby, don't!" Abby looked her father dead in the eye and said, "What are you hiding under here, Daddy? Why am I not allowed to see it?" By now, Abby's mother stood by her husband's side. "Abby, what are you doing in here?" "Why aren't you in bed? Daddy is hiding something from us, Mom. He's been acting suspicious all week, and I know because I've been watching him." Her mother looked at her confusedly and then at the red-stained sheet. "Connor, what is that?" Abby's mother confusedly asked. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he tried to think of a good answer. Abby was still standing confidently next to the object with the sheet gripped tightly in her hands. When her father failed to answer, she had enough and pulled the sheet down. Her mother gasped, and Abby stood frozen in place. Her eyes were wide in shock. Suddenly Abby screamed, and she ran to her father with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Daddy. Thank you." Abby's father sighed and hugged his daughter tightly. "You ruined your own birthday surprise, you little monster." Abby's mother smiled at her husband. "I had no idea you were building her first bike." And in her favorite color too, she put her arms around her husband and kissed him on the cheek. "Now, shall we go back to bed?" she said to Abby when she finally let go of her father. Abby nodded. Her cheeks were blushing as she turned to her father and apologized for not listening to him. She had totally forgotten her birthday was in a week and didn't think it could be a birthday surprise he was hiding. It looked so scary, so her imagination had run wild, only to find out it was a bright red bike all along. The events of this story are entirely fictional and are products of the author's imagination. Images included are meant for illustration purposes only. Any resemblance to actual events, places or persons, living or dead, are entirely coincidental.